Hello, dear friend. Welcome back to the Sleeping Tones. Tonight, we enter the world of a man who whispered rather than shouted, a man who taught French music to breathe with new elegance, who showed that beauty lives in subtlety and that grace needs no grand gestures. Tonight, we walk beside Gabriel Fauré, the forgotten master who inspired an entire generation, the teacher who shaped Ravel and Boulanger, the composer who wrote a Requiem without fear and proved that the quietest voice can echo the longest. So settle into your pillows, let the weight of the day dissolve, and allow yourself to be carried into the story of this remarkable soul, this gentle revolutionary, this dreamer who showed music new ways to sing. It is a warm spring morning in the small French town of Pamiers. The year is 1845. Sunlight filters through narrow medieval streets. The Ariège River flows quietly beyond the town walls, and in the distance, the Pyrenees Mountains rise like ancient cathedrals against the southern sky. Inside a modest home on an unremarkable street, in a room with whitewashed walls and worn furniture, at 4:30 in the morning on May 12th, a child draws his first breath. His parents name him Gabriel Urbain Fauré. Gabriel after his grandfather, Urbain after a maternal uncle. He is the youngest of 6 children, born to Toussaint Honoré Fauré and Marie-Antoinette Hélène Lalaine Laprade. Nothing about the moment suggests history in the making. The room is simple, the furniture plain, and the family occupies that uncertain space between comfort and struggle, between respectability and want, where appearances must be maintained even as resources remain modest. Toussaint Honoré Fauré is a schoolmaster, a man who teaches children to read and write, who believes in education and discipline, and the quiet virtues of hard work. He is practical, methodical, reserved, a man of order and routine. Marie-Antoinette comes from minor aristocracy, from the Lalaine Laprade family, who once owned land but whose estates were sold long ago, and now there remains only the memory of better days and a certain pride that persists despite diminished circumstances. For his first 4 years, Gabriel does not live with his family. This was not uncommon in rural France, where infants were often sent to wet nurses, women in nearby villages who cared for children while mothers recovered and fathers worked. Gabriel lives with a foster family in a village whose name history has not preserved. He will remember almost nothing of those years, only vague impressions, light through windows, the smell of bread baking, voices singing in rooms he can no longer picture. When he is 4 years old, his father is promoted to director of the École Normale at Montgauzy, a training school for teachers, and the position brings prestige enough that the family can finally be reunited. Gabriel returns to his parents' home, to a house full of strangers who claim to be family, brothers and sisters he barely knows, a father stern and distant, a mother affectionate but overwhelmed by the demands of a large household. The boy is quiet, watchful. He does not cry or complain but simply observes, learning the rhythms of this new life, discovering his place in a world that had continued without him. One day, when Gabriel is perhaps 5 years old, something happens that will change everything. The family visits a local chapel, a small stone building with wooden pews and stained glass windows that cast colored light across the floor, and in the corner, against the wall, stands an old harmonium. The harmonium is a reed organ powered by foot pedals that pump air through metal reeds, and it makes a wheezing, breathy sound, not as grand as a pipe organ, but warm, intimate, somehow human. Gabriel approaches the instrument. His small hands reach for the keys, and he begins to play. Not songs he has been taught, for he has not been taught any songs, but sounds he creates, patterns he discovers, harmonies that emerge from his fingers as if they had always been waiting inside him. He will later say that he played atrociously, with no method at all and no technique whatsoever, but he remembers that he was happy, completely and utterly happy in a way he had never been before. A blind woman who lives near the chapel hears him playing through the open door. She recognizes something in the chaotic sounds, some quality she cannot name but knows is rare, and she hurries to find Toussaint Honoré, telling him that his youngest son has a gift. Around the same time, a member of the National Assembly named Simon Lucien Dufour de Saubiac visits Montgauzy on official business and happens to hear young Gabriel at the harmonium. He too recognizes the gift. He tells Toussaint Honoré that the boy must be trained, that he must go to Paris to the École Niedermeyer, a school for church musicians where talented boys learn to become organists and choir masters, where they can have a future. Toussaint Honoré hesitates. Paris is far away, hundreds of kilometers from Pamiers, and the boy is only 9 years old, and the cost of boarding school is beyond what the family can afford. But Saubiac promises to help, to use his influence to secure a place, and so in October of 1854, when the leaves are turning and the air grows cold, Gabriel boards a train for Paris. A journey to a city he has never seen, to a school where he will spend the next 11 years. 11 years without his family, without the mountains, without anything familiar, a childhood spent in exile. The École Niedermeyer sits on the Rue Faubourg Poissonnière in Paris, a tall, narrow building 4 stories high where the sound of scales and hymns echoes from morning until night. The school was founded by Louis Niedermeyer, a Swiss composer who believed that church music was dying and needed to be saved, that France needed organists who understood the old sacred traditions, the Gregorian chants and Renaissance polyphony, the music that had been sung in cathedrals for centuries. The boys who study here are poor, most coming from rural families, and they are here because they have voices or talent, because the church offers one of the few paths to respectability for boys without money or connections. Gabriel is 9 years old when he arrives. He shares a dormitory with 30 other boys, sleeping in narrow iron beds, waking at 6 for morning prayers, attending classes all day, studying Latin and solfège and harmony and counterpoint, learning to play the organ and the piano, singing in the school choir. The discipline is strict. Speaking is forbidden except during recreation periods. Meals are eaten in silence. Letters home are limited, and visits are rare, and the world outside the school's walls seem very far away. Gabriel is homesick, deeply and painfully homesick, but he does not complain, and he simply endures, and he plays the piano. His first teacher is Louis Niedermeyer himself, an older man now in his 50s, kind but exacting, and he shows Gabriel the music of Bach and Handel, the fugues that are like mathematical puzzles made of sound, and he teaches him Gregorian chant, those ancient melodies that move in modes, that rise and fall like waves, that have no fixed rhythm but simply breathe. Gabriel learns quickly. His ear is extraordinary, and he can hear a melody once and remember it perfectly, and he can identify chords by sound alone. And when he improvises at the piano, something remarkable happens. The other students stop what they are doing and gather around to listen, because what Gabriel plays is unlike anything they have heard, not learned but discovered, not imitated but created, as if music flows through him from some source they cannot see. In 1861, when Gabriel is 16 years old, Louis Niedermeyer dies suddenly, and the school needs a new piano teacher. They hire a young organist named Camille Saint-Saëns, who is only 25 years old but already famous, already recognized as one of the finest musicians in France. Saint-Saëns is unlike any teacher Gabriel has encountered. He does not believe in teaching only sacred music, but thinks students should know everything. The German romantics like Schumann and Mendelssohn, the revolutionary works of Franz Liszt and Richard Wagner, the piano, works of Chopin with their nocturnes and mazurkas, music that shimmers and sighs, that speaks in a language the old masters never imagined. Saint-Saëns plays them excerpts from Wagner's Tannhäuser and Lohengrin, and he shows them Chopin's preludes and nocturnes, and Gabriel is transfixed. This is the music he has been searching for without knowing it, not the rigid counterpoint of the textbooks, not the mathematical perfection of Bach, but something more fluid, more human, more alive. Saint-Saëns recognizes Gabriel's gift immediately and becomes not just a teacher, but a mentor, a friend, a champion. And he tells Gabriel that he must compose, that he has something to say that needs to be said. One afternoon, Gabriel sits alone in the school dining room while the other boys play in the courtyard, and he begins to write his first song. He sets to music a simple poem by Victor Hugo called Le Papillon et la Fleur, the butterfly and the flower, and the melody is gentle and the harmony conventional. But there is something in it, a voice beginning to emerge, a sensibility that is unmistakably his own. In 1865, when Gabriel is 20 years old, he composes a choral work for a school competition, the Cantique de Jean Racine, a setting of a 17th century hymn for choir, organ, and strings. The piece is serene and luminous, moving like morning light, not storming or demanding, but simply glowing with a quiet radiance that seems to come from another world. The work wins first prize, and Gabriel graduates with his diploma as a maître de chapelle, qualified to serve as a choir master and organist, ready to begin his career. He is 20 years old, having spent more than half his life at the École Niedermeyer, and now he must leave, must find work, must survive in a world that does not care about promise or potential, but only about what one can provide. His first position is in Rennes, a city in Brittany, far from Paris, where he becomes organist at the Church of Saint-Sauveur. The pay is meager and the work tedious, playing for masses and weddings and funerals. The same hymns over and over day after day, and there is no audience for the songs and piano pieces he composes in his spare time, no one to perform them, no one to publish them, no one except himself to hear what he has created. And then in 1870, everything changes when France goes to war with Prussia. It is supposed to be a quick victory, a chance for Emperor Napoleon III to reassert French dominance in Europe. But instead, it becomes a disaster. The French army is crushed at Sedan. The emperor is captured. The Second Empire collapses overnight, and Prussia lays siege to Paris. Gabriel volunteers for military service, though he is 25 years old and has never held a rifle. But France is in danger, and he goes, joining the light infantry, issued a uniform that does not quite fit, and boots that blister his feet, and a rifle heavier than he expected. He sees combat, not the glorious kind from books, but the real kind, mud and cold and fear and the sound of artillery in the distance and the smell of gunpowder and death. He helps lift the siege of Paris, fights in minor skirmishes, sees young men die for causes they do not understand, and returns from it changed in ways he cannot articulate. After the war comes something stranger when Paris rises in revolution and the Paris Commune is declared, and for 2 months workers and radicals govern the capital. Gabriel takes refuge in Switzerland, where the École Niedermeyer has temporarily relocated, and he teaches there and waits and wonders what will become of France, of Paris, of everything he has known. The Commune is crushed in blood during what will be remembered as Bloody Week, with thousands executed in the streets, and by October 1871, Gabriel returns to Paris, to a city quieter and heavier, and changed forever. He takes a position as assistant organist at Saint-Sulpice, one of the great churches of Paris, and through Saint-Saëns, he gains entry to the salons, those evening gatherings where artists and intellectuals meet, where composers and poets gather, where ideas are exchanged and connections are made. At these salons, Gabriel meets everyone who matters in Parisian cultural life: Gustave Flaubert, the novelist, and Ivan Turgenev, the Russian writer, and Georges Bizet and Hector Berlioz, the artists and thinkers who define an era. And at the salon of Pauline Viardot, the famous mezzo-soprano, he meets her daughter Marianne. She is a young woman with dark eyes and a quick wit who plays the piano and paints, and Gabriel falls in love with her deeply and completely, and they become engaged in 1877 when Gabriel is 32 years old. Finally, he has found happiness, a position as choir master at the Madeleine, a future, a love, and then without warning or explanation, Marianne breaks off the engagement. She simply decides she does not want to marry him. Gabriel is devastated, heartbroken in a way he has never been before, and he cannot bear to see her, cannot bear to attend the salons where she will be, and so he flees Paris. He travels to Weimar, where he meets Franz Liszt, the great composer, now an old man, and Gabriel plays his own works for Liszt, seeking validation and comfort. And from Weimar he goes to Cologne to hear the operas of Richard Wagner, Der Ring der Nibelungen, 4 operas spanning 15 hours of gods and heroes and apocalypse. Gabriel is impressed by Wagner's magnificent orchestration and ingenious leitmotifs, but the experience leaves him cold somehow, too much and too heavy, and too German, and he returns to Paris, and in 1883 marries Marie Frémier, the daughter of Emmanuel Frémier, a leading sculptor. It is not a love match, but a practical arrangement, for Marie is respectable and well-connected and will make a suitable wife, and Gabriel needs stability. They have 2 sons, Emmanuel in 1883 and Philippe in 1889, and Gabriel provides for them, but the marriage is distant and formal and correct, lacking warmth or intimacy or understanding, and Gabriel works constantly, teaching piano and harmony to pay the bills, playing at funerals and weddings, composing late into the night, songs and nocturnes and barcarolles, Music that is exquisite and refined and elegant and subtle. Music that does not shout or demand, but whispers, and few people are listening. In 1877, the same year his engagement ends, Gabriel becomes choir master at the Église de la Madeleine, one of the great churches of Paris, a massive neoclassical temple in the heart of the city with Corinthian columns and marble floors where the wealthy and powerful attend Mass. The Madeleine becomes his second home for the next 50 years. He plays for services and weddings and funerals, hundreds of them, thousands of them, the same liturgy over and over, the same prayers and rituals. And in 1887, something happens. Two events close together. In March, his father, Toussaint Honoré, dies, and in December, his mother, Marie Antoinette, dies. And Gabriel attends their funerals and plays the organ at the services and watches their coffins lowered into the earth, and something shifts inside him. He has been thinking about death for years, attending all those funerals at the Madeleine, hearing all those Requiem masses with the same music and the same fear and the same terror of judgment and hell. The Dies Irae with its day of wrath and fire and damnation, music designed to terrify the living. Gabriel hates it, is tired of it, wants to write something different, a requiem that does not frighten but comforts instead. He begins composing in the autumn of 1887, quietly and without telling anyone, sketching ideas and finding melodies, and discovering a new kind of prayer. He works on it through the winter and through the spring, and by January 1888, he has a first version with 5 movements and perhaps 20 minutes of music. On January 16th, 1888, the Requiem is performed for the first time at the Madeleine for a funeral of a parish member, an architect named Joseph Michel Le Souffaché, and the music begins quietly with the strings playing a gentle theme and the choir entering softly, singing Requiem aeternam dona eis Domine. Grant them eternal rest, O Lord. And there is no drama, no thunder, no fear, only gentleness and peace. The offertoire follows with altos and tenors, singing in canon, prayer rising like incense, O Domine Jesu Christe, Rex Gloriae, O Lord Jesus Christ, King of glory. And then comes the Sanctus, where the choir sings Holy, Holy, Holy so softly it is almost a whisper before suddenly the brass and choir burst forth with Hosanna in excelsis. What follows is the heart of the work, the Pai Jesu, where a solo soprano sings alone with a melody that is simple and heartbreaking, rising like a prayer, Pai Jesu Domine dona eis Requiem. Blessed Jesus, grant them rest. And the accompaniment is sparse with just organ and strings, creating space around the voice, letting it breathe and float. Camille Saint-Saëns, who attends the Pamiers, will later say that just as Mozart's is the only Ave Verum Corpus, this is the only Pai Jesu, perfect and complete and irreplaceable. The Agnus Dei follows with violins playing a gentle rocking theme, and the choir singing in sweeping phrases, and then comes a moment of pure beauty when the harmonies shift, chromatically singing Lux Aeterna, Luceat eis Domini. May light eternal shine upon them, O Lord, colors washing over colors like light through stained glass. Then the Librami, where Gabriel has eliminated the Dies Irae, the day of wrath and terror of judgment, offering instead gentle music with a baritone solo singing of deliverance not from punishment, but from suffering and weariness and sorrow. And finally, the Imparadisum, where the sopranos sing alone at first, high and ethereal like voices from another world, while organ and harp create shimmering arpeggios, and the music floats weightless and rising like a soul ascending. In Paradisum, Deducem Angeli, may the angels lead you into paradise, and there, with Lazarus who once was poor, may you have eternal rest. The music fades to silence, not an ending but a dissolving, a gentle release, and the congregation sits in stunned quiet. After the service, the curé confronts Gabriel, asking what that mass was, and Gabriel answers calmly that it is a requiem of his composition. And the curé says they do not need these novelties, that the Madeleine has a rich enough repertoire and Gabriel should be content with that. But Gabriel is not content and continues working on the Requiem, adding movements and revising and refining. And by 1893, it is complete with 7 movements for soloists and chorus and organ and orchestra. Years later, someone will ask Gabriel about the piece, saying that it expresses no fear of death and has been called a lullaby of death. And Gabriel will respond simply that this is how he feels about death, as a happy deliverance, a reaching for eternal happiness rather than a mournful passing away. And he adds almost apologetically that perhaps he sought to depart from convention because for so long he was organist at services of interment and is fed up with that and wanted to do something different. But his humility conceals something profound, for Gabriel Fauré has reimagined the Requiem, has stripped away centuries of fear, and offered in its place comfort and grace and peace. The 1890s bring change slowly at first, then all at once. In 1892, Gabriel is appointed Inspector of Music Conservatories, a government position that takes him to provincial cities to evaluate programs and attend recitals and write reports. And it pays better than teaching piano and means he no longer has to instruct bored adolescents. That same year, he meets a woman named Emma Bardac, the wife of a wealthy banker and a patron of the arts who hosts a salon where musicians gather. She is cultured and intelligent and musical, understanding composers in ways most people do not, and she had been the mistress of Camille Saint-Saëns, and now she is drawn to Gabriel. They begin an affair, discreet and passionate and transformative, and Gabriel has been married to Marie for 9 years, but the marriage is cold and distant, a business arrangement that brings no joy, and Emma awakens something in him. In June of 1892, Emma gives birth to a daughter named Emma Bardac, nicknamed Dolly, and whether Gabriel is the father remains uncertain, but he adores the child. Between 1894 and 1897, Gabriel composes a suite of piano duets dedicated to Dolly, 6 pieces for 4 hands, with titles like Berceuse and Miaou and Dolly's Garden and Kitty Valse and Tenderness and Le Pas Espagnol. And the music is charming and playful and tender, full of affection and delight, a father's love made audible even if he cannot publicly claim the role. For Emma, Gabriel composes something even more significant, a song cycle based on poems by Paul Verlaine called La Bonne Chanson, the Good Song, 9 songs that tell the story of love and longing and joy and union. The poems Verlaine wrote when he fell in love with Mathilde Motet, before everything collapsed into chaos, and Gabriel sets them with new freedom. The vocal lines following the natural rhythm of French speech, rising and falling like conversation, and the piano does not merely accompany, but creates atmosphere. The harmonies are more daring than anything he has written, modulations that dissolve rather than resolve, chords that shimmer and blur, a language becoming more fluid and modern. And Gabriel dedicates La Bonne Chanson to Emma directly, so everyone who knows them understands what it means. This is a declaration, a public acknowledgement of love that cannot be spoken but can be sung. The affair continues for several years, and then, as these things do, it fades, and Emma will go on to marry Claude Debussy in 1908, becoming his second wife. But the relationship with Gabriel has done something important, has liberated his music, has shown him that he can write with passion, that elegance need not mean coldness, that restraint can contain fire. In 1896, two major appointments arrive when Saint-Saëns retires as chief organist of the Madeleine, and Gabriel is promoted to the position he has been working toward for nearly 20 years. And the same year, Jules Massenet resigns as professor of composition at the Paris Conservatoire, and Gabriel is appointed to replace him. Suddenly, at 51 years old, Gabriel Fauré has arrived, having prestige and influence and security, no longer the struggling organist or overlooked composer, but a master. His students at the Conservatoire include some of the most talented young musicians in France: Maurice Ravel, who will revolutionize orchestration, Georges Enescu, the Romanian virtuoso, Nadia Boulanger, who will become the most influential pedagogue of the 20th century. Gabriel teaches composition not as a set of rules, but as a way of thinking, encouraging individuality, and telling his students to find their own voices and trust their instincts. Ravel will later say that Gabriel's teaching consisted largely of saying, "That's good," or "That's not quite good enough," without explaining why, forcing students to develop their own critical judgment. In 1900, Gabriel composes a large-scale work called Prométhée, a lyric tragedy in 3 acts based on the Greek myth of Prometheus, written for an outdoor theater in Béziers. And the premiere is a triumph performed in an ancient Roman arena with hundreds of performers and torches lighting the stage and the audience wild with enthusiasm. For the first time in his life, Gabriel experiences popular success, not just respect or admiration from fellow musicians, but genuine acclaim and recognition. In 1905, the director of the Paris Conservatoire, Théodore Dubois, resigns, and Gabriel is appointed to succeed him. And at 60 years old, he becomes the most powerful figure in French musical education. He immediately begins reforms, restoring discipline and updating the curriculum and fighting against the conservatism that has made the institution stagnant, and the older faculty hate him for it, calling him Robespierre after the revolutionary who sent so many to the guillotine. But Gabriel persists. He champions younger composers and defends students when they are unfairly judged. And in 1905, when Maurice Ravel is denied the Prix de Rome, Gabriel publicly protests, causing a scandal but not caring, believing in merit and talent and progress, and refusing to allow politics to stifle genius even when it costs him friendships and makes him enemies. The directorship leaves him little time for composition, so he can only write during summers when he escapes Paris and retreats to the Swiss lakes, to Lausanne and Evian-les-Bains and Annecy, small towns where the air is clear and mountains rise across still water, and he can breathe. There, in rented rooms overlooking water and mountains, he composes works for piano, nocturnes and barcarolles and preludes, and impromptus and valses caprices. The nocturnes are not like Chopin's, not singing with operatic melody, but more abstract and interior, music that exists in half-light, in the space between waking and dreaming. Nocturne number 1 in E-flat minor dates from 1875 when Gabriel was 30 years old, gentle and melancholic, a young man's sorrow made beautiful with melody that rises and falls like breathing. Nocturne number 6 in D-flat major comes 20 years later in 1894 when the harmonies have become more ambiguous and the tonality shifts like sand, so you think you are in one key and suddenly you are somewhere else entirely. Nocturne. Number 13 in B minor is written in 1921 when Gabriel is 76 years old and nearly deaf, and the music is spare, almost skeletal, with every note essential, moving slowly with melody fragmented like thoughts interrupted, like memory failing, like a mind reaching for something just beyond grasp. The barcarolles evoke the gentle rocking of boats and the rhythm of water, but they are not pictorial. They are meditations and reflections on time passing. Barcarolle number 1 in a minor appears in 1880 when Gabriel is 35, the music rocking gently with left hand playing a constant rhythm like oars dipping into water and right hand singing a melody that seems to float. Barcarolle number 5 in F-sharp minor comes in 1909 when Gabriel is 64 and the harmonies have become more complex and modulations more daring, and the piece moves through distant keys like a boat drifting from harbor into open sea. Barcarolle number 13 in C major is his last, written in 1921 when he can no longer hear, and the music is luminous and transparent, as if all the richness has been distilled to pure light. Gabriel writes 13 nocturnes over the course of his life and 13 barcarolles, each one more refined than the last, each one stripping away everything unnecessary until only essence remains. The late works are almost austere with harmonies pared down to essentials and melodies that seem to emerge from silence and return to silence, music that trusts the listener to complete the meaning. But there are other works too, chamber music that explores new territories like the Piano Quartet number 1 in C minor, written between 1876 and 1879, when Gabriel is still young and still finding his voice, the first movement passionate and almost Brahmsian in its intensity, but the second movement scherzo is pure Faure, light and dancing and elusive with harmonies that shimmer and dissolve. The Piano Quartet number 2 in G minor comes much later in 1886, when Gabriel's voice is fully formed and the music is more concentrated and personal, the slow movement heartbreaking with a melody that seems to carry all the sorrow of the world, but gently, without drama, just a quiet statement of pain, and then resolution not triumphant but accepting, as if to say, this is life, this is how it is. In 1898, Gabriel receives a commission to write incidental music for a London production of Maurice Maeterlinck's play Pelléas et Mélisande, the same play that Claude Debussy is turning into an opera. But Gabriel's approach is different, writing orchestral pieces to accompany the drama, a prelude and entr'actes, and a spinning song in Sicilienne. The music is atmospheric and mysterious, evoking the medieval setting, the castle of Allemande in the forest, and the well and the tower, and the Sicilian becomes particularly famous. A gentle lilting melody in the rhythm of a pastoral dance, but tinged with melancholy, as if remembering something lost. And the piece is often performed on its own, arranged for various instruments, cello and piano, flute and piano, a melody that seems to belong to everyone and speaks to something universal. From 1903 to 1921, Gabriel writes for Le Figaro as a music critic, attending concerts and writing reviews and offering opinions on new works. And his criticism is measured and thoughtful, never attacking or mocking, but simply evaluating with the same restraint that marks his music. He writes about Wagner without hysteria, acknowledging the genius but also the excess, the way Wagner's music overwhelms rather than invites. And he writes about Debussy with admiration, recognizing the innovation but also noting the differences, how Debussy paints with sound while Gabriel composes with line. He writes about Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, the piece that caused a riot at its Paris premiere, and Gabriel is not shocked or offended, but simply observes that this is a new language, one that he does not speak, but one that has its own validity, and his reviews reveal his philosophy that music is not a competition, that there is room for many approaches, that genius takes many forms, and each composer must follow their own path. In 1900, Gabriel meets a young pianist named Marguerite Hasselmans, who is 24 years old and intelligent and gifted and understanding, and they begin a relationship. Gabriel sets her up in an apartment in Paris, and they are quite open about it. His wife Marie knows, and everyone knows, for it is the arrangement of the time among artists and intellectuals where marriage is one thing and love is another, and Gabriel and Marie have not loved each other for years. Marguerite becomes his companion and confidant, understanding his work in ways Marie never did, listening to his new compositions and offering gentle opinions, managing practical matters and correspondence and appointments, and the endless administrative details that overwhelm him, creating space for him to compose, and for that he is grateful. She will remain with him until the end of his life, through deafness and illness and the dark years of war, a constant presence. Gabriel's days at the Conservatoire follow a rhythm, arriving mid-morning and walking through the grand entrance on Rue de Madrid, past the busts of great composers, Beethoven and Mozart and Gluck, and his office is modest with a desk piled with papers and a piano against one wall and windows overlooking the courtyard where students gather between classes. He holds composition lessons in a small classroom with 6 or 8 students at a time who bring their work, pages of manuscript paper covered in notes, and Gabriel sits at the piano and reads through the scores silently and then plays them slowly and carefully. He does not lecture or explain rules, but simply points to moments that work and moments that do not, asking the student, "Do you hear why this progression is effective?" or "This one does not convince me. Try again," and offering no explanation or prescription, forcing the student to figure it out themselves. Maurice Ravel is one of his most talented students and one of the most difficult, brilliant, and meticulous with orchestration like jewelry, but also proud and stubborn, not taking criticism easily, and Gabriel sensing this is gentle, more gentle than with other students, saying beautiful but perhaps here this doubling is unnecessary, and Ravel bristles and defends his choices, and Gabriel nods and says nothing more. Later Ravel will remove the doubling and realize Gabriel was right, but in the moment he needs to discover it himself, and Gabriel understands this. Nadia Boulanger is different, absorbing everything and asking questions and taking notes and returning the following week with revisions that show deep understanding, and she will become the greatest teacher of the 20th century, teaching Aaron Copland and Virgil Thompson and Elliot Carter and Philip Glass and Astor Piazzolla and Quincy Jones and dozens of others. And she will teach Gabriel's methods, his philosophy, that composition is not about rules, but about listening and trusting one's instinct. Years later, Boulanger will say of Gabriel that everything she knows about composition she learned from him, not techniques or formulas, but how to listen, how to recognize truth in music. Gabriel also teaches George Enescu, the Romanian violinist and composer, a prodigy who entered the conservatoire at age 10 and could play anything and compose anything. And Enescu will bring Romanian folk music into classical forms and write orchestral works of stunning color. And always he will credit Gabriel for teaching him that national identity and sophistication need not conflict. Charles Couchlin studies with Gabriel too, and will become a composer and orchestrator who will orchestrate Gabriel's Pelléa et Mélisande, taking the piano score and creating the shimmering orchestral version we know today. And Couchlin will say that working with Gabriel taught him restraint, that you do not need every instrument playing at once. That space is as important as sound, that silence is not emptiness. In 1905, Gabriel faces his greatest challenge as director when the Prix de Rome competition takes place, and Maurice Ravel, now 30 years old and already known with works performed and critics writing about him, enters for the 5th time. Ravel is by any measure a significant composer, but the judges dominated by conservative faculty eliminate him in the preliminary round, not allowing him to proceed to the finals, and it is a humiliation, a public rejection. Gabriel is furious, knowing this is political, that the older professors resent Ravel's modernism and want to punish Gabriel for his reforms, and he protests publicly, writing letters to newspapers and demanding an investigation. The scandal becomes known as l'affaire Ravel and forces the resignation of Théodore Dubois, the former director, and it creates enemies for Gabriel, but also establishes his integrity, his willingness to fight for his students. Ravel, though disappointed, never forgets Gabriel's support, and years later, when Gabriel is dying, Ravel will visit him and sit by his bedside and hold his hand. And when Gabriel asks weakly, "Have I been a good teacher?" Ravel will answer through tears the best. But as Gabriel enters his 60s, something terrible begins. At first it is subtle, sounds becoming distorted with high notes seeming too sharp and low notes too flat, and music no longer sounding right, like hearing through water, like the world wrapped in cloth. He visits doctors who examine him and test his hearing using tuning forks and having him identify pitches, and the diagnosis is grim, progressive deafness called otosclerosis, a hardening of the bones in the middle ear with no treatment and no cure, only inevitable decline. The condition worsens rapidly, and by 1910, Gabriel can barely hear the middle register of the piano, the notes between F below, middle C, and F above, the heart of the piano's range, gone, and he can hear low bass notes dimly and high treble notes as thin, distant chimes, but the center where melody lives has become silence. By 1915, he is almost completely deaf, able to feel vibrations if he places his hand on the piano, sensing the rhythm but pitch and timbre and harmony lost to him. But worse than the silence are the hallucinations, his brain starved of auditory input, creating sounds that are not there, phantom music distorted and wrong. He hears everything transposed down by a third, so a C major chord sounds like a minor, bright becoming dark, major becoming minor, the world retuned to sadness. He hears pitch shifted, so an orchestra playing in tune sounds out of tune to him, and a violin's pure tone sounds like screeching, and music becomes torture. He stops attending concerts, cannot bear to hear his own works performed, cannot bear the distortion, the beautiful made ugly by his failing ears. Friends visit and try to talk, but conversation becomes impossible. He cannot hear their words or follow what they say, and he nods and smiles and pretends to understand. Marguerite learns to write notes, carrying a small notebook and writing questions and comments, and he reads them and writes back, their relationship conducted in silence and ink. He continues his duties at the conservatoire, but how can a deaf man lead a music school? How can he evaluate performances he cannot hear or judge compositions he cannot experience? And he relies on trusted colleagues who sit beside him during auditions and whisper assessments in his ear. And he reads their lips and nods and makes decisions based on their input. But it is exhausting. Every day, a battle. Every interaction, a reminder of what he has lost. And the loss is not just practical, but existential. For music is not just his profession, but his language, his way of thinking, his identity, and now it is gone. He continues to compose because he must, because music is all he knows. But now he composes in silence, hearing only in his mind. He sits at his desk with manuscript paper before him, and pen in hand, and writes notes he cannot hear, imagining the sounds, the harmonies, the voicings, the way a melody will rise, the way a chord will resolve or refuse to resolve, and years of training guide his hand, decades of experience, the internal ear that every composer develops, but it is not the same. He cannot test his ideas at the piano, cannot hear if a passage works, cannot make adjustments based on sound, and he must trust memory and theory and instinct. Sometimes late at night he weeps quietly so Marguerite will not hear, weeps for the music he can no longer experience, for Beethoven's symphonies he will never hear again, for his own works now lost to him. But in the morning he returns to the desk, to the manuscript paper, to the silent composition, because what else is there to do? In 1913, after years of work, Gabriel's opera Penelope premieres, a project that began years earlier when Gabriel had been searching for an opera subject for decades, reading dozens of proposals and meeting with poets and playwrights, but nothing felt right. Everything seemed either too grand or too trivial. Then a young poet named René Fauchois approached him with a proposal based on Homer's Odyssey, not the adventures of Odysseus, but the waiting of Penelope, the faithful wife who waits 20 years and refuses the suitors who demand she remarry, and weaves during the day and unweaves at night, and believes against all reason that her husband will return. Gabriel is moved by the subject, this story about faith and endurance and fidelity, about maintaining dignity in the face of despair, about hope that refuses to die, and he begins composing in 1907, working on it for 6 years through summers in Switzerland and winters in Paris, and through the progressive loss of his hearing. The opera is in 3 acts with music restrained and noble, not trying to compete with Wagner or Strauss, with no loud climaxes or orchestral bombast, instead moving with the inevitability of myth, the vocal lines following the contours of French speech, and the orchestra creating atmosphere without overwhelming, and everything serving the drama. The premiere takes place on March 4, 1913, at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées, and Gabriel, now 67 years old and significantly deaf, attends the performance, sitting in a box with Marguerite beside him. He cannot hear the music properly, everything distorted and transposed and wrong, but he watches the audience. They are respectful and attentive, applauding at the end of each act, and the critics write favorable reviews praising the nobility of the work, the restraint, the French elegance, but it is not a popular success. The public wants spectacle. They want Massenet's melodrama or Puccini's passion, and Gabriel has given them something quieter, something that requires patience. Penelope receives a few more performances and then disappears from the repertoire, not to be revived until after Gabriel's death, and even then only occasionally. Gabriel is disappointed but not surprised, for he has never been interested in popularity, only in creating work that is honest, work that reflects his vision, work that refuses to pander. And he tells Marguerite late one night after the premiere that he wrote what he heard, what he believed, and if the public does not want it, that is not his concern. He can only be faithful to the music. And she squeezes his hand and writes in their notebook, and the music is beautiful. In August 1914, war comes to Europe when Germany invades Belgium, and France and Paris is threatened, and the government flees to Bordeaux. Gabriel is 69 years old and too old to fight, but he feels the war's weight as students disappear into the army, Enescu and Aubert and Schmidt, and friends' sons die and young composers are killed in trenches, and Ravel volunteers as an ambulance driver, driving through shelling to evacuate wounded, and an entire generation vanishes into mud and barbed wire and mass graves, the world Gabriel knew ending and a new world darker and stranger being born. Food becomes scarce, with meat disappearing from markets, and bread rationed, and butter and eggs and milk becoming luxuries, and coal becomes scarce. And the winter of 1916 is brutal, with temperatures dropping below freezing and not enough fuel to heat homes properly. Gabriel wraps himself in blankets and wears a coat indoors, with his fingers stiff with cold, but he continues to compose because what else can he do? The world is falling apart and young men are dying, but music remains. Music persists. In 1915, he writes a short piece called Berceuse Héroïque, Heroic Lullaby, dedicated to Belgium, to King Albert and the Belgian people resisting occupation. And the piece is gentle but resolute, a lullaby that acknowledges suffering and offers comfort, but also dignity. He begins signing his letters differently, before signing simply Gabriel Fauré, but now writing Gabriel Fauré, musicien français, Gabriel Fauré, French musician. And after decades of resisting nationalism, of believing music belongs to no nation, he finally embraces his Frenchness not out of hatred for Germany, but out of love for France. Gabriel also completes a series of sonatas, a sonata for cello and piano, written in 1917 with two movements sparse and direct, the cello singing long melodic lines and the piano providing harmonies, but everything reduced to essentials with no ornament and no padding, just melody and harmony in their purest form. a sonata for violin and piano also in 1917, and his last public performance will be of this work in September with violinist Gaston Poulet. Gabriel sits at the piano and cannot hear what he is playing, but his fingers know the notes and his body remembers, and Poulet plays the violin part while the audience listens in reverent silence, knowing they are witnessing something final, something precious. The music is exquisite, lean and clear and luminous, the first movement moving with quiet intensity, and the second marked andante heartbreaking with a melody that seems to carry all the sorrow of the war, all the loss and grief, but gently without drama, just a quiet statement of pain. And then the finale marked allegro vivo, not triumphant or joyful, but accepting, as if to say, this is life, this is how it is. We endure, we continue, we find beauty where we can, and we do not give up. After the performance, people approach Gabriel and shake his hand and embrace him, and some are crying, and they do not need to speak for their faces say everything. Gabriel also writes a sonata for flute and viola and harp, a strange combination, 3 instruments that rarely play together, but the result is magical with the flute floating above, light and airy and free, the viola providing warmth in the middle, and the harp creating shimmer below, and together they create a sound unlike anything else, ethereal and transparent, like music heard from another world, like something glimpsed through a veil. These sonatas are meant to be the first 3 of a series of 6, one for each standard instrument, and Gabriel plans to write sonatas for oboe and horn and clarinet, but he will not complete them, for time is running out and his body is failing, and there is only so much strength left. In March 1918, Germany launches a massive offensive and brings up the Paris gun, a massive cannon that can fire shells from 80 miles away, each shell weighing over 200 pounds, and the gun fires on Paris day and night with shells falling randomly across the city, buildings collapsing and streets cratering and people dying without warning. On Good Friday, a shell hits the church of Saint-Gervais during a concert, during a performance, and the roof collapses and 88 people are killed. Paris becomes a city under siege, and those who can flee to the countryside, but Gabriel cannot flee. He is too weak and too ill, and he stays in his apartment on Rue des Vignes with Marguerite staying with him. They hear the explosions in the distance and feel the building shake when shells land nearby. And at night, Gabriel lies awake listening to the silence that is now his constant companion, wondering if tomorrow a shell will find them, if this is how it ends, but he survives. The offensive stalls and the war turns, and by November 1918, the armistice is signed and Germany surrenders. Paris celebrates with people pouring into the streets and bells ringing and flags waving. The nightmare is over, but over 16 million people are dead, an entire generation lost, and Gabriel, sitting in his apartment, can only think of his students who will never return. In 1920, Gabriel resigns from the conservatoire, 75 years old and completely deaf, and his health failing, unable to perform his duties. But he continues composing, working on a string quartet, the most difficult form with 4 instruments and 4 equal voices and no accompaniment and no hiding. For years he refused to attempt it, too intimidating with Beethoven's shadow too large, but now, near the end, he tries. He works on it through 1923 and 1924, composing in complete silence, hearing only what his mind creates, trusting memory and trusting instinct. And by September 11th, 1924, it is finished. The String Quartet in E minor, Opus 121, his final work, his farewell. The first movement is marked Allegro moderato, opening with all four instruments playing together, a chord, a statement, and then the first violin begins a melody simple and direct, but containing everything Gabriel has learned, every refinement of a 50-year career, every lesson about how notes relate to each other. The second movement is a scherzo, light and quick and elusive with the instruments chasing each other, trading phrases and overlapping, creating a texture that shimmers and dances. The third movement, Andante, is the heart of the work, slow and quiet and introspective, the cello singing a long melody and the others providing soft harmonies. And this is Gabriel saying goodbye, not dramatically, not with grand gestures, but simply and honestly, acknowledging that the end is near. The finale returns to quicker tempo, but it is not triumphant. It is not resolved. It simply continues, persists, and then it ends quietly as if the music simply decides to stop, not because it has reached a conclusion, but because it has said what it needed to say. Gabriel tells Marguerite after finishing the quartet, writing in their notebook, that he has written a quartet for strings without piano. This is a genre which Beethoven made famous and causes all those who are not Beethoven to be terrified of it. And he adds, "But I had to try. Before the end, I had to see if I could do it." The quartet will not be premiered until after his death, and he will never hear it, never know if it works, must simply trust that it does. 2 months later, on November 4th, 1924, Gabriel Fauré dies at 79 years old. The cause pneumonia, his lungs filled with fluid, his breath becoming shallower and weaker. Marguerite sits beside him holding his hand, and he cannot speak, cannot hear, but he squeezes her hand weakly, and then quietly, he is gone. A state funeral is held at the Madeleine, the church where he served for 50 years, where he played thousands of masses, where he composed his Requiem. Dignitaries attend, musicians and students, the President of France and members of government, and the composers of France gather to say goodbye. Ravel is there, weeping openly, and Nadia Boulanger with her face grave, and Enescu, who traveled from Romania, and Kuchlin and Aubert and Schmidt, and hundreds of others, students he taught, and musicians he influenced, and people whose lives he touched. His Requiem is performed, that prayer without fear, that vision of death as deliverance, and it feels now like a prophecy fulfilled, the sopranos singing In Paradisum, "May the angels lead you into paradise. May you have with Lazarus, who once was poor, eternal rest." The music fades to silence, and they carry his coffin from the church through streets lined with mourners to Passy Cemetery, where he is buried on a hillside overlooking Paris, among trees and birds as he wished, in a green place, a quiet place. The gravestone is simple, with just his name and his dates, no epitaph, no declaration, for the music speaks for itself. Gabriel Fauré's influence flows quietly through music history like water-shaping stone, gradually and persistently and inevitably. And he did not invent a new system or write manifestos or proclaim revolutions or create a school of followers, but simply composed with integrity and restraint, and a belief that music need not shout to be profound, that subtlety is not weakness, that elegance can contain passion, and that beauty often lives in what is left unsaid. Maurice Ravel took Gabriel's elegance and made it jewel-like, refining it further and making it even more precise. And Ravel's pavane for a dead princess echoes Gabriel's own pavane with the same gentle melancholy and the same modal harmonies and the same refusal to sentimentalize. Ravel's string quartet dedicated to Gabriel shows the lessons learned, the cyclical form and the shimmering textures, and the way harmonies blur and dissolve. These are Gabriel's techniques taken further, and when Ravel writes Le Tombeau de Couperin, a suite for piano honoring French Baroque style, it is Gabriel's spirit that guides him, the clarity and grace and restraint. Nadia Boulanger taught Gabriel's principles to generations of composers from her studio in Paris and her summer school at Fontainebleau, teaching Americans and Germans and Russians and Poles. Aaron Copland studied with her in the 1920s, and she taught him that American music could be elegant, that folk material could be treated with sophistication, that simplicity is not the same as simple-mindedness. And Copland's Appalachian Spring shows these lessons with spare textures and modal harmonies, and the way a single melody can carry an entire movement. And this is Gabriel's influence crossing the Atlantic. Elliott Carter studied with Boulanger in the 1930s, and she taught him Gabriel's method, not rules, but listening, not formulas, but instinct. And Carter would go on to write music nothing like Gabriel's, complex and dissonant and modernist, but the rigor underneath, the craft, the refusal to waste notes that comes from Gabriel. Philip Glass studied with Boulanger in the 1960s when she was 80 years old, still teaching and still sharing Gabriel's philosophy, and still insisting on clarity and purpose. And Glass would create minimalism with repetitive patterns and slowly shifting harmonies, music that seems worlds away from Gabriel's, but the underlying principle is the same, that every note must earn its place. Astor Piazzolla, the Argentine tango composer, studied with Boulanger, and she taught him that popular music and art music need not be separate, that tango could be sophisticated, that folk forms could be treated with the same care as classical forms. And this was Gabriel's lesson, that beauty is not about genre, but about honesty and craft, and respecting the material and the listener. Gabriel's harmonic language influenced Claude Debussy, though Debussy went in different directions, becoming more pictorial and more impressionistic. But the underlying approach was similar, both men believing that harmony could shimmer without resolving, that chords could be colors rather than functions, that the ear could be satisfied without traditional cadences. That suggestion is more powerful than statement. Gabriel's melodic sensibility influenced Francis Poulenc, whose songs and piano music and religious works all show Gabriel's touch, the way melody follows speech rhythm, the way harmonies can be both simple and surprising, the way music can be serious without being solemn and playful, without being trivial and heartfelt, without being sentimental. And Poulenc's own Requiem, written in his final years, is clearly in conversation with Gabriel's, with the same gentle approach to death, and the same refusal to frighten, and the same vision of rest and peace. Gabriel's restraint influenced an entire aesthetic, a way of composing that became distinctly French, that valued clarity over complexity and grace over power, and that trusted the listener to complete the meaning and left space for imagination, and understood that silence is not emptiness, but a partner in sound. Perhaps most importantly, Gabriel showed that music could evolve without rupture, that you could honor tradition while moving forward, that innovation need not mean rejection of the past. He wrote tonal music his entire life and never abandoned melody or harmony, but within those forms he found infinite possibilities, stretching tonality without breaking it, making chords do things they had not done before, move in ways they had not moved, create colors that had not been heard, all while remaining accessible and human and touching. His harmonic innovations are still studied in conservatories. The way he uses ninth chords as stable sonorities, the way he moves in parallel motion without destroying voice leading, the way he modulates through inharmonic reinterpretation, the way he uses modal scales within tonal frameworks, creating ambiguity between major and minor, between resolution and suspension, between arrival and departure. Music theorists have analyzed his language for over a century, trying to codify his methods and explain how he achieves his effects. But the music always exceeds the analysis, because Gabriel was not following a system, but following his ear, trusting instinct over theory, pleasure over prescription. Today, his Requiem is performed constantly all over the world at funerals and concerts and on recordings, a prayer that comforts without frightening, that acknowledges loss without succumbing to despair. Choirs love it because it is singable, the vocal lines lying well in the voice, not straining or forcing, allowing the singers to make beautiful sound, and audiences love it because it speaks to them directly without pretension or obscurity, requiring no specialized knowledge but simply touching the heart. His piano music is played by students and masters alike, the nocturnes and barcarolles and impromptus, those quiet meditations, those conversations with the night, and pianists discover that the music is more difficult than it appears. The notes not particularly hard, but the voicing and pedaling and subtle rubato requiring deep understanding. Young pianists learn the early nocturnes and find them beautiful and accessible, and then as they mature, they return to the late nocturnes and discover depths they never suspected, the 13th nocturne in B minor, becoming a test not of fingers, but of musicianship, of the ability to make silence sing. His songs are sung in recitals worldwide, a pré en rêve, after a dream, the song he wrote when he was 20, when he was still a student, a simple melody and simple accompaniment, but perfect and complete. A young composer's first masterpiece, still moving listeners over a century later. Clair de Lune, Moonlight, one of his settings of Paul Verlaine, with the piano creating pools of sound and the voice floating above like light on water, and Les Roses d'Ispahan, the Roses of Isfahan, from his song cycle Deux Mélodies, exotic and sensuous and elegant, a vision of distant lands made in sound, and each song is a perfect miniature, a moment captured, a feeling made audible, a poem given wings. And musicians still study his music, not for innovation, though it is innovative, not for complexity, though it is sophisticated, but for craft, for the way every note earns its place, for the way melody and harmony become one, for the way silence is respected, for the way beauty can be both refined and heartfelt. Composers study his scores to learn how he achieves such transparency, how 4 or 5 notes can create an entire world, how a simple progression can be made to shimmer, how less can be more. Conductors study his orchestration, though he orchestrated sparingly, preferring chamber textures and trusting individual timbres rather than blended masses. and his Requiem in its chamber orchestra version uses strings and harp and timpani and organ and a few wind instruments, not the full romantic orchestra, but the effect is profound, more profound perhaps than a larger force would achieve, because each instrument can be heard and each line is clear. This becomes a lesson for later composers, that intimacy is not weakness, that chamber forces can create power, that you do not need 100 musicians to move the heart. Film composers have learned from Gabriel too, though they may not know it. His techniques for creating atmosphere and for underscoring emotion without overwhelming it, the way his music supports drama without calling attention to itself, the way it creates mood through harmony and texture rather than through obvious melodic gestures. And this is the language of film music, tracing back in part to Gabriel's innovations, to his Pamiers, and to his Requiem, and to all those scores where music and drama become one. Gabriel Fauré taught us that revolution need not be loud, that change can arrive on quiet footsteps, that the most profound transformations often happen in whispers. He showed us that music can be intimate without being small, elegant without being cold, restrained without being passionless, French without being provincial. He proved that you can honor the past while creating the future, that tradition is not a cage but a foundation, that craft and inspiration are not opposites but partners, that rules exist to be understood, then transcended. More than a century after his death, his music still rises like morning light, still offers comfort to the grieving, still provides models for composers seeking their voices, still reminds us that grace need not announce itself, that elegance is not coldness but concentration, that subtlety is not timidity but courage, that the whisper can carry further than the shout, and that the quietest voice can echo the longest. Perhaps it is fitting that Gabriel remains somewhat mysterious even to those who study him most closely, for he did not write an autobiography, did not give many interviews, did not explain his methods or philosophy, but simply revealed himself through his music, and even there only in glimpses. He was a private man, reserved and controlled, revealing himself only through his music, and even there only in glimpses. Those who knew him describe contradictions. In public, charming and witty and diplomatic. At Parisian salons, the perfect guest making conversation and flattering hosts, and playing his latest works at the piano. And he loved billiards, playing for hours, the geometric precision of angles and impacts, the quiet concentration it required, and it was perhaps like composing. He loved good food and fine wine, though never to excess, always maintaining control, always keeping some part of himself private. Women found him attractive despite his small stature and quiet demeanor, something in his eyes and in the way he listened, and in his obvious intelligence and sensitivity. He had affairs throughout his life. Emma Bardac and Marguerite Hasselmans and others whose names are lost, discreet but not secretive, and his marriage to Marie was distant with them living parallel lives, sharing a household but little else. And she never understood his music and never attended his premieres, and he did not seem to mind, or perhaps he minded, but accepted it with quiet resignation. With his close friends, Gabriel was different, more open and more vulnerable, able to discuss music for hours, arguing about harmonies and debating interpretations. And he maintained lifelong friendships with Saint-Saëns despite their differences, Saint-Saëns conservative and Traditional but having been Gabriel's teacher and champion, and Gabriel never forgot that debt. When Saint-Saëns died in 1921, Gabriel, though deaf and ill, attended the funeral and paid tribute to the man who had shown him the path and given him permission to compose. With younger composers, Gabriel was generous, listening to their music and writing letters of recommendation and helping them find performances and publishers. And he never felt threatened by the next generation, never worried that their innovations made his work obsolete, understanding that music is not a competition, that there is room for many voices. His daily routine when he was working was disciplined, rising early and having coffee and bread, reading the newspaper and attending to correspondence, and then at mid-morning going to the piano. He composed at the piano unlike some composers who work at a desk, needing to hear the sounds and test the voicings and feel the keys beneath his fingers. And he worked slowly, a few measures at a time, trying different possibilities, rejecting most and keeping a few. When something was right, he knew immediately. It felt inevitable, as if it had always existed, as if he was simply discovering it rather than creating it. He revised constantly, with works going through multiple versions and years passing between sketches and final form, never satisfied and never certain. And friends would ask, "Is the piece finished?" And he would shrug and say, "For now," implying that he might return to it, might find something to improve. This perfectionism came from doubt, from a deep uncertainty about his own gifts, and he never quite believed he was good enough, never quite trusted his instincts completely. Yet this doubt was productive, preventing complacency and pushing him to continually refine, to strip away everything unnecessary until only essence remained. In letters to friends, he revealed his anxieties about money and recognition, about whether his music would endure, about whether he was wasting his life, worrying that he was not ambitious enough, that he should be writing symphonies and operas, grand works that would establish his reputation, not songs and piano pieces that seemed so small. Yet he kept returning to those small forms because they felt natural to him, because he could say what he needed to say in 5 minutes, in 3 pages, without needing an hour in an orchestra. His musical philosophy, insofar as it can be reconstructed, was based on listening, on trusting the ear over theory, on following pleasure rather than prescription. He believed that music should be natural, that it should flow like speech, that it should not call attention to its technique, that craft should serve expression, not the reverse. He distrusted systems and manifestos and schools, believing that each composer must find their own path, that there are no universal rules. When students asked him about a progression, "Is this allowed?" he would answer, "Does it sound good to you?" And when they said yes, he would say, "Then it is allowed." This was not laziness or permissiveness, but a deeply held conviction that music is not mathematics, that the ear is the final arbiter, that rules exist to be understood, then transcended. He believed in restraint not from coldness or lack of passion, but from respect for the listener, from understanding that overwhelming is not the same as moving. He believed that music should leave space, should allow the listener room to breathe, and room to feel, and room to imagine. That suggestion is more powerful than statement. He believed in beauty not as decoration or superficiality, but as a kind of truth, as a glimpse of something eternal. He once said that he does not believe in ultimate explanations, but believes only in what touches him, in what makes him dream, in what makes him forget for a moment himself. And this is what his music does. It does not explain or argue, but simply exists like light on water, like wind through trees, inviting us to stop and listen and allow ourselves to feel without judgment or analysis, just pure experience. And in that moment of listening, something happens, something that words cannot capture, a kind of communion between the composer and the listener, between sound and silence, between memory and hope, between sorrow and consolation, between this world and something beyond. This is Gabriel Fauré's gift to us, not just beautiful music, though it is that, but a way of being in the world, a way that values quietness over noise and depth over surface and grace over force and the whisper over the shout. And so the story of Gabriel Fauré comes to rest. More than a century after his birth, his music still rises over the world like morning light, unresolved, luminous, breathing. He showed us that silence is not emptiness, but a partner in sound. That beauty may whisper and emotion may arrive as a shade of light. That music need not march toward resolution, but can simply be. If you enjoyed this journey tonight, let yourself rest a little longer. There are more lives, more dreams, more music waiting for you here at the Sleeping Tones. Thank you for listening, and good night.